What I'd like to say right off is, of all the books that people have made, this is the best book that anyone's ever done on me. And I'd like to thank David Zwirner, because I wanted a book like this to be done, and the occasion of the show, of the early work he offered, and the catalog he produced just is heartwarming for me. In that period that the book covers, there were about 25 works in the show, but the period there were about 210 works done, so it's just about a tenth of the work. When I first arrived in New York, I had gone to Yale, and I had a Yale traveling and then a Fulbright, and I had met Phil Glass in Europe and came back to New York, and I introduced Phil to Steve Reich, and I started a small trunking company, and we were moving furniture, and there was a downtown group of people, myself and Glass and Reich and Michael Snow and Spalding Gray, and just local people who lived south of Canal. And there wasn't any art world, so to speak. There were just people who were performing, so to speak, or working, so to speak, for each other. And no one specified themselves or defined themselves as a sculptor, or painter, or choreographer, or filmmaker, or whatever. People were just experimenting with different modes of working, and there was some things people had in common. Seriality, repetition, physical material, the deconstruction of everything that came before, don't trust anyone over 30, and pass the joint. And one of the things that was true about the group of people is that the dancers, especially Yvonne Rainer and Tricia Brown and Simone Forti, they were kind of the leaders of the pack. So there would be performances by the Judson group, and the artists who were involved would go to those performances, and after there would be these dance sessions that would go on in various lofts, and it became a very cohesive group of people, kind of self-sufficient. I'll give you one example that I constantly return to try to explain to people how the situation was. Simone Forti Whitman was doing a performance across the street from Max's Kansas City, and everybody used to go to Max's and just hang out with each other and fight mainly, or debate. And we'd go across the street, and we heard that Rauschenberg and Simone were having a performance. And we were on the 23rd floor, and Rauschenberg did a performance where he was being pulled around inside of a box, and whatever noises he was making in the box were being transmitted. And I thought I had seen it before, and I thought it was a little post-cage, and to tell you the truth, I was kind of bored. And then all of a sudden, the lights in the room that we were sitting in dimmed, and a light went on outside the window. And so you have about 40 people sitting in a room looking at this window, and then all of a sudden, a person fell by the window, and then another person, and then another person, and then another person, and then another person, and probably 25 people fell by the window. And what they were doing is they were running up to the 25th floor and jumping down to the 23rd floor, and we were on the 24th floor, and you didn't know that there was a pile of mattresses on the floor below, and they were falling, and I was standing next to Michael Snow, and he said, Muybridge in action. Well, these kind of events were going on with this group of people weekly. And what did she do after the performance? She passed the hat. So it was like a cohesive group of younger people who weren't involved with an older generation, an older art scene, but were really trying to create a movement. They didn't think of a movement. They were trying to create work for each other, and there were certain parameters that they stayed within. And a lot of it had to do with movement, physicality, repetition, seriality. I remember Reich lived down the street from me, and I hadn't met Steve. And one day I asked him what he was up to, and he said, well, why don't you come up and listen? And he had been in San Francisco with taping music and replaying the tapes back on top of themselves. And he said, I just taped a piece in Harlem. And I said, what's it about? And he said, well, listen. And he had gone up to a precinct in Harlem, and a kid had been picked up, and the kid didn't want to get thrown into the tank. So the kid said, and Reich had a microphone, he said, I squeezed my bruise till the blood came out. And then he repeated it. I squeezed my bruise so the blood came out. And then he repeated it again on top of itself, but a little faster. So pretty soon it said, I squeezed my bruise so the blood came out. And I thought, holy shit, this guy has, just came out of Harvard. He's got a major in philosophy, and he's recording a guy in Harlem who's squeezing his bruise so the blood came out, and he calls himself a composer. And I've been hanging out with Phil Glass in Paris and then in Italy, and it was very close to Glass's music, only this guy was using language to replay it on top of itself. So, and I was driving a truck moving furniture, and I got Glass and Reich together, and then Spalding Gray, and then Michael Snow, and it was like a kind of self-propelling group of people. The work that's in this catalog really is pretty much comes out of being involved with that group of people and dealing basically with the physicality of material, process, the residue of process. One wasn't particularly concerned about what later became called deconstruction. One was concerned about finding a way to do one's own work and finding a way to have a certain feedback within what one was doing in relation to the process. What I had done is I wrote down a list of verbs: to crease, to fold, to bend, to tie, or whatever, and just enacted them in relation to place or time. When you do something like that, you don't necessarily come up with a solution you can call art. I remember one of the things, Phil Glass was working as a plumber at the time, so we went and bought some lead, and we took 35 feet of lead, and we rolled it up and looked at it and said, maybe, maybe not. And then we took another piece of lead and rolled it from both ends in and said, probably not. And then we took a piece of lead and we rolled it again, and on the same piece of lead, rolled it on top of itself. If you make a double roll inside of the contained circle, you can do that. So there were 3 rolls out of one piece, and it was called Slow for Philip Glass, and we showed it at the Whitney. And at the same time, I had taken a piece of rubber and just took it on its side. One of the verbs was called to lift, and just lifted it up, and it sustained itself, and I thought, maybe. And I had taken 4 sheets of lead, and I had propped them up in my studio, and I was married at the time. I put some dunnage inside because I thought if it had collapsed or imploded, it would have gone right through the floor and probably the next floor. And I had Phil and Chuck Close and Reich and Snow help me assemble it. And I was married at the time, and my wife came over and saw it, and she said, Richard, you can't show that. And I said, why is that? And she was already showing, and I said, why can't I do that? And she said, because that's not art, and you're going to hurt somebody, and you're up to no good, and you're smoking too much dope. And I said, if I can't show that work, I don't think we're going to stay married. And she said, don't show it, and we got divorced. So the proposition of what one did was very serious. It might have sounded like, a bunch of young kids in downtown New York working for each other, but the stakes were very high, and people were very, very concerned about if you're going to make a line of bricks, and Andre was holding out for the number of bricks in relation to the line. Those things were battled out nightly at Max's. I think what this book is evidence of is a certain kind of time capsule of that period and the energy that went into making without a preconception about what the hand-me-downs of tradition were, and that's about it. So any questions?
I'm going to bring you a microphone, actually. Sorry.
I guess, given the state of the world right now and the state of the art world and how large it is, I was wondering if you thought that there was still a chance for artists to find a group within which they could actually grow and find their own voice and focus on their work and not just enter the art world.
I think the art world has become involved with speculation and the variabilities on expectation. So speculation and expectation have kind of taken over from what was used to go by aesthetic criteria. So there's very little critical writing being done, and most of the people who are involved with the art world are involved with a kind of market consumption, and I'm involved with it. Everybody's involved. Everybody's in the art world is implicated in it. How one finds a group of people that understands that they're going to be marginalized and are still going to hang out or on an edge of being marginalized and have a certain conviction that they're going to sustain being marginalized and throw bombs in from the outside. I don't know if it can happen here. I don't know if it can happen in New York. It might happen in India. It might happen in New Zealand. I don't know. I don't see it happening in New York because the market has such a stranglehold on the whole situation. But it could happen. That's not saying it's not going to happen. It might happen. But I don't see it happening, and one hopes that it would happen. It doesn't take many people. It takes 5 or 6 maybe. 5 or 6 people to get together, have a strong idea, and just say, the hell with the rest of it, and do their thing, and it could happen. I think you just have to have faith, and I think young people have to talk to each other. They have to find their own watering hole, and they have to connect. And I think every generation deserves what it gets. Yeah.
It's possible to have a conversation with artists that were reduced to their work and still find an outlet?
Well, what was interesting when I first came to New York is that the older people who were in the art world took us in with open arms. Jasper Johns was enormously helpful to Phil Glass and myself. Donald Judd was like a older brother for me. So they were helpful. They understood that you were up to no good in a good way, and they liked it and they supported it. But the art world was very, very small, and everybody knew each other. And everybody went to each other's openings. Now I think what happens is because of the marketplace kind of divides the situation into different camps and different competitive groups and different brand names or whatever. So I would think young artists have a more difficult time, particularly when artists are becoming kind of surrogate brand CEOs. I mean, where artists are starting to compete with business in that way. I think for a young artist, that's a hard choice. I mean, do you want to be Murakami or Damien Hirst, or do you want to hang out and do your own poetry? It's very, very hard to know. And so you find that there's a different kind of person going to an art school with a different kind of expectation. So it's a different generation. I would hope that your question implies that you think that's still a possibility, and I would hope it's a possibility also, but it may be that I have speaking from a certain idealism of a foregone year. I don't know. But I don't really believe that. I still think, if I look at American art from Marsden Hartley to Pollock to Newman to Johns to Nauman, pretty much a continuum there. And if you look at it, most of painting, sculpture, whatever, in the last century, was people working in rooms. People working in a room, just confronting themselves in a room, whether it's Pollock on the floor or Giacometti in front of a piece of clay or whomever. And that's still going to hold true. You can say, no, there's another way of doing it. We go back to Moholy-Nagy and, we stamp it out and have a manufacturer do it, and we're all new CEOs. But I think there's something still interesting about the fact that matter informs form, and you have to get a hold of the matter. And the matter is the material, and everybody has a different sensibility in relationship to the fact that little boys like corduroy and little girls like silk. Everybody has a certain predilection for the matter of the matter. And if you're interested in form and not image, then you have to get involved with the matter of the matter. And I think right now, particularly since the internet and whatever, everything's done on JPEG, so there's a presumption of that the image rules. But that doesn't do much for the innovation of form, and particularly if you think that form is what moves generations, not image and not ornament, then you're into a game of investigating the possibilities of how do you develop form, and there's not a lot of that going on, not in painting or sculpture at least. There's a lot of image reshuffling, and there's a lot of thumbing through the the postmodernist history book. But in terms of breakthrough form like Pollock or Newman, or reiteration of Duchamp like Johns, or the idiosyncratic work of Naumann, I don't see it. I mean, if it's there, I haven't seen it. And I pay attention. There's not a lot going on.
Wonderful. Another question out there? Okay, bringing the microphone. Sorry. As an artist who often works serially and whose work has changed so much over time, at least I think, how do you know when you've perhaps exhausted a certain line of work? How do you know when it's time to move on to something different? Or perhaps do you view your work as a continuum of one thing flowing smoothly into the next, into the next?
Some sequences are open, so that means that there's a possibility within the sequence to follow the possibilities of the sequence. Some serial forms close, and when they're closed, you understand that you've used up all of the permutations, or that there are 2 or 3 solutions within the permutations that satisfy all of the axioms that are presented by the thesis of the didacticism of the moment. So you say, screw it, I've done the best thing I could have done and I'm not going to do anymore. But then there are sequences that are open, and you can revisit them, and there's a possibility of the fact that as you resolve a problem in the sequence, albeit it leads to another problem that you couldn't have foreseen if you hadn't stayed with the problem. And it's not like hitting your head against the wall doing something over and over again because you're crazy. It's that something out of the repetition is not the same that leads you to something else. And I'm a big believer in that.
Other questions? All right, guys, we have time for one more. Okay, final one out this way.
Hi, thank you. Going back a little to what he was asking, how about going at it alone as opposed to trying to find a group? Is that possible? Does it help?
Joseph Cornell on the Utopian Parkway, absolutely. I mean, for sure people can go it alone. I mean, I think most writers go it alone. Yeah, I think you can go it alone. Although I think if you go it alone, you have to be aware of what's been done, what's being done. And you probably have to be a certain kind of obstinate renegade. Hard to do, because I think everybody needs a witness. And I think witnesses are important. And then you probably also need someone as a translator to get the work out into the world. So if you can find a witness and a translator, you're really lucky. I met Dick Bellamy when I was very young, and I met him in Venice. My eyes watered because I just came out of the desert, sandstorms. And he became a witness. And I didn't even understand how he was a witness, but I was working downtown, and if you're working alone, and I was from San Francisco and hadn't lived in New York very long, I knew the friends I knew downtown, but I'd never shown in the gallery. And this was a dealer who would phone me up every day, and he would ask me how the weather was. And I would walk to the front of my loft, look out the window, come back, answer the phone, and tell him it was foggy. Or after I did that for about 20 days, I realized he wasn't asking me about the weather. He was asking me about my work. But I was so literally fixated on the fact that the guy asked me how the weather was downtown that I would actually do that. And what he was asking me is, how was my work developing? I think if you're going to work alone, you need someone to reflect off of, whether it's a friend or someone who's more knowledgeable or someone who's in the art world. You need some kind of feedback. I think it's very, very, very difficult. The idea of being a primitive right now that's hard to understand how that could be. Might be, but I mean, I just read a thing about finding a woman's suitcase, I think in Chicago, who had taken photographs all her life of 8mm films, big stash of them, and they're saying she's as great as anyone ever lived. Well, hard to understand. It's very rare.
Wonderful.
Anybody?
Yes. Okay. They were being shy.
This isn't really a question. It's just something I wanted to share with you. We live in California, and one of your pieces was being installed at a performance center out in Orange County. So my husband and I take ourselves down there, And as we're approaching these beautiful buildings, this incredible piece of your work is being erected. In fact, it's up. And the cement around it isn't together yet, and there's a security guard like marching around. And as we're approaching, he says to us, "Come here, come here." And he takes us inside the piece and starts to sing. And the piece had the opening on top. You know what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I was there when it went up.
And the sound, the sound was incredible. And it gives me shivers, and it has brought us so much joy. And I have the opportunity to tell you that, and that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Since a lot of your work is very site-specific now, how do you feel looking back at the earlier works as they've been in different locations?
Well, I mean, if you're splashing lead against the wall when you first start out, and you're then uncorking it from what you've splashed, that's probably working in place in relation to a site. The fact of the matter is that the work has been, when I can, been site-specific as much as it can be. It's just that you don't have that many opportunities to build work in locations where it's going to remain in terms of the site. We just came from Doha when we were able to build a large piece in the desert, which is unheard of. But people don't like to give over property for something that's not going to be transferable to somebody else. So to build works in place that are going to remain, which is something that that's my aspiration. It's hard to find commissions. But what was the second part of the question?
You know, now you've seen like this is how you usually work. Now you've seen like pieces that have been in one spot and then another spot, and then, this made David Zwirner. Do you feel like they have different relations and how they...
You mean if works are done that aren't site-specific and they're relocated?
Yeah.
I try to stay on top of the work as much as I can, and I have contracts that say that I have first right of refusal, and if the works are going to be recited, I tend to recite them if I can, which, you don't get paid for doing that, but I've done it. I've done it like 2 or 3 times in the last year. I mean, I just find it a responsibility and obligation to my work, but it's a problem.
Wonderful. That's about all the time we have for the discussion portion of the program this evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Richard.